Okay, so one of the topics, I guess, to kind of quickly, I started a thread on X having to do with the topic of Canaan, and I had talked about how one of the things that's kind of peculiar about talking in reference to Canaan is that in the Americas, or the United States, I guess you can say in the Americas as well, there was this certain group. So there's a lot of different Christian groups and factions, interpretations, and so I also think as we're going forward, we have to realize that it can't all be painted with a broad brush. As we're approaching global networked conversations pertaining to economic systems, religion, culture, belief, regional natural resources, sustainability, etc., all of these various things having to do with questions of a functional world network system. It's involved in these things is these questions of religion and whatnot, and certain approaches, and so I was saying how, I was getting to though, like the nuance of it. We have to start kind of differentiating between various groups and generalizations, understanding the different types of stories that are under the surface of a lot of generalizations. And then, among a variety of things, kind of starting to understand various dynamics. But anyway, in reference to the topic of Canaan, what's also of interest is that some forms involved in the trajectory of these types of conquest narratives and whatnot had associated or justified some of their approach to world expansion and world dominion in reference to battling ideas of God and conversion, or compliance, as you would say. It's not always conversion in a religious sense. There's involved within the trajectory of the world system, you start to find these also types of atheism, where atheistic intentions. You start to find, so that's another thing, is just kind of looking at the world dominion systems and what allows it to function in the ways that it does. What is actually animating, fueling, and powering it. And so I've been involved in the past online with interactions with atheists, and I've read some of their material, and I was familiar with some of the approaches, and so at some level you start to find there was this battle for the world dominion, the trajectory, the system, if you will. And they would also approach the quote-unquote enemies of the system in very similar ways. And so it wasn't just conversion to religion as much as conversion to compliance and absorption, integration into this world dominion type system. Anyway, in the midst of that then was this justification accompanying the system with certain influential approaches of religion. As I said, not all factions, because there was a lot of different groups that really did serve communities and whatnot, but there were approaches that associated the occupying of land and the integration and the tactics and expansion utilized within the dominant system as justification likened to the conquest of Israel conquering the Canaanites. And so obviously as an indigenous person in the Americas, being labeled as a Canaanite in relation to this world system that was the conquest of Israel conquering the world for God, when I get into the stage of looking at what is God like, where does this come from, how do we unpack these conquest narratives, is this really a testimony of the stage of Jesus? Would Jesus have taken that approach, or was Jesus a part of transforming that approach? So anyway, there's a lot that goes into this stage of interpretation. To quickly explain where I stand on it is that I think that's an incorrect approach. I think even though in the midst of the world dominion system, there's some legitimacy preserving what the Christ Act was about, and So I do think there's something to preserve there. But I think in general, it's accompanying itself and attempting to animate itself in its methodology and approach in line with the world system, I think is inaccurate. I don't think that is some type of portrayal or attributed to what God is like. What seems to, and there's a lot to be said here, but what seems to be going on there is the trajectory and the unresolved portions of the world dominion system that even at the time of Jesus, when Jesus completed, I'm trying to simplify this, but so I guess I'll just kind of speak of it in basic terms, because almost every portion of this needs to be unpacked and interpreted. But anyway, Jesus basically represents the stage of this, what's supposed to be good news for people, liberating access to God, ability for flexibility to negotiate on terms of increasing what God is about, a lot of these other things. And it was supposed to be this freedom, like in my estimation when I look at it, from needing to adhere to these types of world dominion forces and tactics. And also it helps reveal a change in how we should look at the conquest narratives, and recognizing that the conquest narratives are more of a reflection of the dominions of mankind and the blood accounts involved in them, and not an accurate assessment of what God is like or the methodology of God. So I guess in simple terms, I think that approach is just inaccurate. I think it would have been better if you rewind the tape and we asked what could have been done differently. The idea of what Jesus, in the midst of this world dominion trajectory, was doing looks a lot different than what we see in the dominant system's portrayal and revisionist type history pertaining to it, as it tries to situate itself and fit itself into a justification based on the role of perpetuating Israel as the conquest narrative and conquering the world as the world is Canaan. I feel like that narrative was a deception encapsulating what Jesus otherwise was supposed to be about, and actually utilizing that stage of tactic does not require the stage of revelation of what Jesus was actually about. And so you find accompanying that, so what you find when people espouse to that approach, it doesn't really require them to utilize the methods of what Jesus talked about or revealed, and they have a difficulty understanding the stage of Jesus, and so they revert to the conquest narratives, which seems to absorb into their human tendencies and not spiritual tendencies. So there's a lot to be said there. But yeah, it kind of speaks to so many things, because when people are looking at the stage of the conquest narratives, taking on the approach of trying to regenerate and animate the stage of Israel as though there was no stage of freedom through Jesus, then they look at the stage of conquest narratives, including looking at everybody as being some type of like heretic to dominate or to either annihilate or enact a type of Amalek. The types of practices that we're seeing revealed in what Israel is doing on the world stage now. So it requires going in and talking about a lot of these things, whether it be, is that really a portrayal of God? How does Jesus change the way we look at the conquest narratives? What was the big reveal there? How would Jesus approach what is deemed like all of this hysteria and superstition of idol worship, where they go in and conquer and tear down all of these other groups? How, if Jesus is supposed to reveal something different, why do we not see a different tactic and a trajectory on the world dominating system stage? And so if we do critique it through the lens of Christ and Jesus, what's different there, right? And so a lot of times, because I tend to say, I think that there was a different path of what Jesus was doing in the midst of this world trajectory, of which I've seen, like I said, as I've studied like the atheist movement, it functions in the same way along this world trajectory without even needing God. And they actually, in a roundabout way, help do the work of critiquing and freeing us from the improper methods of religion or God, in that they thought they were getting rid of religion or God, but they're basically critiquing that everything that religion, not everything, for the most part, the dominant system's religion, their form of interpretation of Christ, if they piece it apart, could be attributed to the same thing that atheists tend to do, except they take the name of God out of it. And so basically what you find there is that they're suggesting that they can function the same forms of success, the same types of mechanisms, and still not arrive upon anything unique unto claims of God. That there's no spiritual distinction there in the majority of the methods. Like I said, that's not to say internally that there aren't actual spiritual practices doing spiritual, mutual, transformative work, you know, in lower levels that are just not a part of the dominant system. There is that. But, so then it's this question, what is distinctive then of Jesus in relation to not utilizing or needing to utilize the conquest narratives? What changed there? Because if something must have changed, lest God would still be doing that, right? There would be no need for this stage of Jesus. But what do we learn then from those teachings and whatnot? And anyway, there's a lot of things for me to address as I'm talking about this. One of them is the question, what could have been done otherwise? What was Jesus doing then in other aspects of history among indigenous people that would have looked differently and that is not part of the dominant narrative that we hardly ever see? How would we approach religion then if we're not doing the conquest narrative, destruction of other territories and lands? And how do you look at that in terms of some of the reflection of the story that leads up to Jesus that are deemed conquest narratives? And so there's so much to talk about there. I guess really quickly what I would say is you find that, and I've talked about this before, you find that Native people, there's testimonies, so it'd be interesting to come up with a list and put this together and look at the stories, but you find that there were spiritual stirrings among Native groups and people, their medicine men, their holy people, where they were having dreams and connections. And so, and there are accounts where there seemed to be a spiritual development that was preparing a connection of mutuality among Native people, utilizing their cultural framework to build that connection. There's a lot to be said about that, because what it means also is it discredits some of the previous issues where people would dehumanize Native people. There's accounts that they wouldn't even think of them. And this is similar with a lot of like colonialist, colonization approaches around the world, expansionism in terms of the world trajectory. There was just this usefulness that they would draw upon, where they would assume that certain interpretations of scripture meant that other people did not have the Spirit of God. That until they accepted Christianity in the version of what they understood that as meaning, they weren't really human. They didn't really have spirits. And so it would be this justification to just slaughter various groups or do what you would with them based on your own perceptions, right? And what you find, though, is that there's certain accounts of tribal people explaining that they had in their communities these expectations or visions or prophecies or things like that to facilitate meeting up with some of these spiritual leaders. And you find that in those accounts that it actually did function to produce receptivity, and that there was receptivity, and there would be development of trade of ideas, and then those were opportunities that would facilitate this connection to what Jesus in the midst of this world trajectory seemed to have been doing in the spirit of what Jesus was about. A lot more to be said about that, like what would have happened if it had been taken in along those approaches. A lot of that was stifled out because what became overarching dominion was the battle for land, a lot of greed, a lot of trajectories of other things. People might differ on their opinions because of those aspects of things. But and it's really raining. I like it though. I like rain. It's good. It's good for the land. And yes, I've talked about that before. So people are aware of me talking about that. There's more to be said about that. Maybe there would be a sit down where I'd put together the examples of it. The reason why, so then the question though would be, why would people resist that? When I say that, what offends them about that idea? And what you find is they become offended by the idea that, because they want to believe in this trajectory of conquest. You see that where there were certain institutions and entities that were kind of on a war conquest. That's what they were animated by, and that's what the lens by which they would see God by. And in the midst of it, though, luckily there were people that weren't doing that. In the grand scheme of things, then, it brings into question, then, how do we look at Jesus, then, in this idea? Is it something universal? Is it something that groups didn't have, and so they needed Jesus, and so we have to, that whole idea of accept Jesus as though it's something that you don't have? How do you draw the line between that in terms of people having previous spiritual experiences that draw them into the connection of Jesus? And I guess my quick answer there is, because I have spent years really thinking about this, and I do feel like I'm very receptive to what I deem as like the Spirit of God, and I don't have any kind of I've worked out settling things with the idea of Christ and the scriptures and whatnot. So for me, that's not something I'm trying to avoid. But at the same time, I've also been around a lot of different exchanges having to do with philosophers and whatnot, and I've really had to obtain a rigorous ability to understand God within, beyond the scripture, and see Christ in that which is not just limited to scripture, is in the universal aspect of the template of how we're created and whatnot. And so what you find, though, is we can ask the question, when we become connected to the idea of Jesus in this way, it isn't just Jesus on its own. There's something that it affects. There are tangible things that start to be produced. And then the question is, what is that? Part of what it becomes, and this is why I do systems theory, is that the idea of Jesus then connects us to an ability to connect with a network of a world system in the midst of a dominating system that can help us to preserve what God is about, and then hope to increase that testimony in the midst of a world dominion. And so it really is the function that Jesus produces in us, the ability to connect to and understand a network that will help to be built spiritually and through different developments along the lines of a way by which we can hope for freedom. It produces an actual system. The practice of adherence to Jesus produces in you interactions of a system by which we can hope to live with and among. So what I'm suggesting here is not that Jesus is how would you say it? So there's a lot of things that are going to have to be looked at differently in terms of what is it to accept Jesus and all of these other things and whatnot. And we can kind of keep looking at that, but it's kind of what happens when you do that? What's the effect? And it's not so much now that we're finding evidence of God through the Spirit of Jesus working through people prior to even knowing about it. So we find that it's not that that there's this spiritual occurrence that couldn't have happened otherwise. We find that there is this ability for it to happen, and that the Spirit of God does function through these various dynamics. But we're also finding then, though, that there is a type of quickening to connect to a growing type of unit and system. And it's this unit and system that becomes critiqued in reference to affecting groups in relation to the world dominant system, the world network. And so it becomes this way by which we can connect to this certain network in relation to aligning and continuing to align for and account for the increase of spiritual connection. And so as we increase in this body of humanity in this spiritual connection, it also calls us into refining some of the things as to how we interact that. So it does quicken and accompany connecting us into this unit, but it creates a standard by which we can continue in that connection, and the attributes by which we grow those relationships, etc., etc., etc. So there's a lot to be questioned there. We can find that this is something that works. I'm doing a little off-roading here, so anyway, bear with me. It's a beautiful day. We're getting a lot of quenching of the land. It's beautiful. So anyway, I hope this is even, I hope this, you can even tell that, like, hear the audio. But anyway, I'm just processing some ideas of things that had come up. And so anyway, that really calls into account a different way of looking at what is even the effect of Jesus. If it can, if we can be spiritually quickened, but then our standard of critique is how we develop a system together. But then that also, among other things, and refine the internal continual absorption of complex relational connections. But then it also calls into question then what should the system look like? And so what we're finding is this battle for refining this system of Jesus in relation to this competing world dominion that claims and lays claim on these ideas as well. And so we're finding that that's in place. As an Indigenous person, this makes me look at this much like in a way that is situated better in my spirit, and also a better attribute of what God is like. Because this means that some of the error of which we would find as error and dehumanizing practices and slights against the attributes and the testimony of God is kind of accurate, because there was something wrong with it. What we also find then is this question. People would say, well, then what should we have done? Because what if, because what's the difference between the way Jesus would have connected this unit in this world body system in relation to like diverse practices and cultures that would be different than the conquest narratives? And so that is something that we need to look at. And I do think that's something that we can really address. And what, on a simple note, what we find is like looking at and seeing the opportunities that God develops, because we are told at some level the stage of Jesus is also relying and leaning on the spirit, right? The spiritual connection, and adhering to and growing those spiritual connections. And what we found though is that was nearly all stifled. Those spiritual connections were almost nearly wiped out and stifled because of the dominant system's approach that is counter to it and does not adhere to these spiritual connections. And so for me, that says a lot as well. That's very revelatory to me in looking at these things. Another question though is that people have, well, how would we, one of the questions that seems to occur is that people will look at the dominating systems, they'll look at the conquest narratives and things like that, and they'll make those applications likened to, so there is some sense where you have to question, how did God actually address things in the Old Testament, right? And a major effect or like a major area of emphasis pertaining to God is there's a lot of things that become, as people I think try to select for the conquest narratives, they approach the scriptures through that lens, and they try to account for things through that lens, and they don't always give themselves room to look at the spiritual workings. But on a quick note, I generally don't attribute the conquest portions to God or God's character. And yes, I've talked about this before, but I tend to think it's a function of the effects of the blood accounts and the hostilities, and then it creating its own animation. People would tap into that type of animation if they adhere to the world dominant system. They tend to fall in line with the way it builds and falls and builds and falls, and so you would see all of these different dominions go along those lines. I don't think that's exactly really where you find God. I think God, because that had happened and had become a skewed lens by which humanity, in terms of world dominions and systems, started to function, God enters into that and would help gauge the timing. And so a major factor of what you see with Israel that actually was distinctive and a part of their high responsibility was to not just do things as the world does, and to connect with other groups. If people wanted to see that aspect of God, they could see it in the narrative, but they just generally haven't. They think of it as like this purity version, but when you actually look for the workings of the Spirit of God and that glimmer of testimony internally, you see that God was creating opportunities for spiritual connection. There were opportunities to increase in those spiritual connection. A lot of times they would be stifled by dominion forces and taking matters into their own hands. Then they'd be critiqued by that. And you also find that there was a huge responsibility and calling for them to adhere to the path of God, as God would gauge the timing and sequence of when those systems rise and fall, and to enter into strategically how to increase the Spirit of God in the midst of that. Therefore, God's not making those things happen. God is guiding them through those things happening. And so along those lines, and you find that what this doesn't mean is that then you can, in your own timing and in your own sequence, go in and misuse the claims of God and become an occupying force, basically generating and manufacturing what appears to be a type of conquest of Egypt or things like that. But so here's the thing. One of the main distinctions with what happened with Egypt was that first, it requires a competing dominion system to develop itself, misusing ideas of God, misusing ideas of culture, misusing certain aspects of practices, and drawing them to themselves to all together in a unit of these contributions, create for themselves a dominion unto themselves at odds with the way of God. And once they get into that position, then they become susceptible to the stages of being critiqued toward their collapse. And a unique aspect of what, the Egypt story is that they had to be in the proper timing. It wasn't just any old time. There wasn't just any old time you go in and make these claims. It had to have been at a time where a system was a certain form of dominion and misuse of all of these different contributions. And that's what's distinct about it. For world dominions to take these stories and misuse these stories and apply them to themselves at any old time in any old way, based on developing their own force through methods of manufactured, siphoned off life forces from God, they're basically using the methods of God in the image of the world dominion systems to make it appear as though they're functioning in this favor of God, but they're creating it themselves. So this is also what the atheists will seem to function as, is like, there's nothing really distinct happening with this. You're not like tapped into something else happening. You're making this yourself. So as an example, people will try to utilize world dominion forces as evidence that they are in the favor of God, but oftentimes functioning through the animation of the death toll and the blood accounts, and producing intentionally compliance onto certain kind of like death trajectories. And they're also using life forces, whether it be resources, whether it be plunder, in the image of world dominions, which is outlined in the mechanism and approach of King Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and various ones, where they start to compete with world dominions when there's only a remnant of the path of God left. And their function of the vehicle by which they do that is through these world dominions and powers. They're not tapping into the timing or sequence of God. And so what you find is that just because they can go in and plunder places, it doesn't mean that they are in the image of God, because it's, comparable to Egypt suffering and producing suffering on people. What you find is that they are producing that suffering themselves. They're producing that imagery, and they're trying to attribute it to a likeness of overthrowing Egypt or overthrowing dominions. And it's not. It's many of the things that would also kill Christ, right? So like what Jesus was talking about when he calls out the forces, and he calls out what they do, and when he calls out the missed opportunities and the spiritual oppression and the aligning themselves with the world powers and these things, right? And so on another note, then, people's questions in this like religious approach would probably be, well, then what about the practices? Do we just adhere to all these practices? I guess my quick answer to the practices, because people really get into this like spiritualizing and conversion competition, and I guess my quick answer with that would be anybody can misuse practices. I've kind of touched on this a little bit when I was suggesting that they that the system dominions collect practices and have them a part of their occupying force, and it's not transformative and it's not in line with God. It's unto themselves for their own power. And that's what you find a lot of times happening with the misuse of any kind of religion. And so on some note, it's not as though I'm saying that there's no place to... So this is different though, because my goal was to have an alternative than the general conquest narratives like in Deuteronomy that accompany conquering lands and tearing down idols and stuff like that. That's not to say that in those days, in that context, that there wasn't a direct association with people literally trying to be dominion gods in relation to their idols. I do think it's a different context, and so there's more discussion to have on that. But it kind of gets into one of those things where people are trying to make that narrative fit with every situation. And they're trying to generate the idea that everyone is associated with like child sacrifice or idol worship, so they can kind of fit that storyline. But I think on some level, it is different. We're talking about, at those times, those idols were associated with competing type god dominions, which, we're associated with different types of occupying force and whatnot. But I also think what you find, on a quick note though, I don't think, even if that was the case, even if it were the case of like looking at idols and all of these ways of competing gods, Jesus wouldn't take that approach. He wouldn't take the Deuteronomy approach, the conquest narrative approach, and he critiqued various ones that had. That's a lot of the very, a main revelation that we see about God through Jesus is that he allows for the ability for people to get out of the hyper superstition, approach to things and be transformative and have spiritual practices of connection and whatnot, and while freeing up a system so that they have room to make those negotiations. One of the main things too was to dismantle the idea that there were other gods, so that people wouldn't, because the animation powers connected to these other gods required a lot of evil things, right? Killing, murdering, occupying force, threats, all of these things, right? Things that were not any attribute of spiritual freedoms. And so it's this idea of providing systems that have attributes of spiritual freedoms, and then in that dismantling and pulling down the ability for other things to prop themselves up as these other powers and whatnot. There's a lot more to say about it, but I also think a lot of things, when not a part of a dominating system, is a huge factor in dismantling it from an improper use. There's a lot of cultural and spiritual practices that can be retrieved if you take out the portions that are abusive or a misuse that is more in line as an attribute of a dominating system. And there's a lot of things that can be retrieved as in the tapestry of human contribution and spiritual practices and things like that. I don't think that that's the standard by which things were approached within the Americas. I mean, people will say, there's this other long conversation about certain things attributed to, these comparisons of Canaan. For one, though, I think the comparison to Canaan is inaccurate.